Thank you so much. And I want to just thank the gentleman from Texas for following up on yesterday's hearing about the Iranian threat in the Western Hemisphere. And I want to thank the Director for your comments and recognizing that there is an Iranian threat and that Hezbollah and Quds Force, all the Iranian proxies and their actual paramilitary groups are trying to infiltrate this country, have operatives in this hemisphere. And your comments sort of contradict the State Department, who I hope is taking note of those comments when they say that the Iranian threat is waning in this hemisphere. I think that's taken a very narrow view. That's sort of like focusing on the row you're plowing and not the field. But so I appreciate the frankness and openness on the Iranian threat, and we're not going to slow down on recognizing and raising awareness for America about that. So I want to just take a moment and thank the mayor for continuing to talk about political correctness. And Director, you may disagree with some of that, but let me just tell you where I'm going, is that I have talked for the last 3 years about the disappearing language of terror. The fact that the 9/11 Commission report used words that really identified the real threat, whether it's the words jihad or al-Qaeda or Muslim Brotherhood or identifying the state sponsors of terror or terrorist organizations themselves. These are identifiers. And when you see that the use of those identifiers are discouraged or those words themselves are stripped from the lexicons of some of the law enforcement agencies, as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, that concerns me. Because I do believe that you've got to be able to identify your enemy and talk openly about your enemy. But when I hear that the DOD and the Pentagon discourage the use of certain identifying words within our military apparatus, and they discourage those officers from talking about those type threats, then you do, I believe, have a Fort Hood type situation where maybe military officers that saw something happening were fearful of identifying that as a jihadist type threat because they were fearful about future promotions or assignments. I understand how the military works there. So I don't think we need to back away from being able to talk about the threats that we face. And so I appreciate the frankness that we're seeing today and from the mayor. And so just segueing into the fact, and let me just say that Mayor Giuliani, in the hours and days and weeks after the September 11th attack, your even-keeled, trustworthy leadership became both a symbol of New York's and our nation's resolve, and I have reason to believe that and the competence of our government's ability to respond to acts of terror and mass disaster really came about from your leadership. So I thank you for that, because I was sitting in South Carolina, and I was watching it from afar, and I was inspired. I was inspired to the point to get back involved in public service. But let me expound on that in that Ted Poe from Texas and I were on a boat in the Philippines, a PT boat, with a Navy, a young man that was in the Navy, manning a .50 caliber gun, fighting the war on terror in Mindanao, in the southern Philippines. As far away from New York as you can think, as far away from Afghanistan as you can envision. And we asked him, "Why'd you join the Navy?" He said, "Sir, I'm from New York." And he said, "My best friend and I went down on September the 12th, and we joined because we never wanted to see that happen again." He was inspired from your leadership, I believe, as well, and he's serving our nation in that. So when we talk about political correctness, and I talk about your leadership, you helped really, I think, start the ball rolling on the see something, say something, to inspire Americans to actually watch your surroundings and be cognizant of what's going on and see that backpack laying there. But when we talk with the DHS about their communication with America, they seem sort of antagonistic. It seems to me that on a whole host of issues, from TSA screening to DHS ammunition purchases, the department does a horrendous job communicating its mission and its policies to the American people. So, Mayor, how would you recommend that the DHS could better engage the American people rather than continuing that antagonism? Because I do believe that see something, say something is part of the answer to involve the American people. So if you could address that, and that'll be my last and final question.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. The reality is this is a very difficult balance, right? We want an alert group of citizens who are reporting to us information that they see that's suspicious. We want police officers who have been trained on the precursors of terrorism. I recommend to you an article written by Commissioner Bratton, oh gosh, about 4 years ago now, in which he describes the training he put the Los Angeles Police Department through to look for the warning signs of a terrorist act. You want a citizenry that's alert to that. You want a police department that's sensitive to it. At the same time, we don't want to trample on people's civil liberties. Because if you have a citizenry that's very alert to that and you have a police department that's very sensitive to it, they're going to occasionally make mistakes. They're going to see something suspicious that turns out to be innocent activity. That's a very difficult balance. It's a very difficult balance to strike. But we have to attempt to do it. We always had to attempt to do it. We now have to attempt to do it if, in fact, we have finally recognized that we face this threat of one-off terrorists, self-inspired terrorists, because the only signs of them are probably going to be these things that you see in the community by the police or citizens. And I think that being honest about what we face will make that citizenry more willing to come forward and make that police department more willing to take a risk in our favor than if we engage in this fiction that there is no war. There is no war against us. Well, that's absurd. I mean, they believe there's a war against us. It's just a matter of whether we recognize it or not. It's absurd to say that there isn't a connection between these things. Within a couple of weeks of each other, there was a connection between Boston and London, right? The bombers in Boston were inspired by jihadism, by Islamic extremism. The guy in London went on television to explain to us he was inspired by exactly the same thing. I don't think we're insulting anybody. I don't think we're offending anybody if we just recognize, reality. And if we don't do that, we're going to lose a lot of these hints. Before September 11, I saw my city saved from terrorism several times by an alert police department that wasn't afraid to come forward. There was an incident that occurred about 2 years before September 11. A young New York City police officer, I think a rookie police officer, was patrolling a subway station in Brooklyn, and he noticed two men that looked Middle Eastern, suspiciously looking at a train station. I don't exactly remember what the suspicion was, but they looked suspicious. He went to his sergeant at the desk at his Brooklyn precinct, and he said, I saw these two Middle Eastern-looking guys, and they look suspicious. Sergeant could have said, oh, forget it, kid. There are plenty of those situations in Brooklyn, and get lost. And the sergeant said, I'll check with the JTTF. So we called in the JTTF. This was about 10 o'clock at night. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the JTTF broke into a row house in Brooklyn and shot this man as he was about to hit the toggle switch of a bomb that would have blown up that entire building. And they were planning to blow up this subway station. This is what we want to happen. We want rookie police officers who are alert enough to pick out things like that, because it prevents, now they can't happen every time, but this is what the FBI needs if it's going to help us prevent these kinds of things from happening. And maybe we have to err on the side a little bit of telling them, don't be afraid to act on your instincts, because every once in a while when they act on their instincts, they're going to make a mistake. But the question is, on what side do we want to err? Do we want to err on the side of making sure we never make a mistake and falsely identify someone as a terrorist who isn't? Or do we want to err on the side of making sure that we don't have any future Boston bombings? And I think that's a political choice, not in a partisan sense, but in a legal sense. That's a political choice that has to be made as to which that we want to do. I know which one I think we should do, but I think that's something that's a little bit confusing right now.
Yeah. Well, let me just end saying God bless you guys and everyone that's working to keep this country safe. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, that if we are honest with the American people and have an adult conversation about the real threat and talk about real terms, that I believe we'll be better off in the long run. So I yield back the balance.
I agree.